The water came for the palazzo, the same night the man did. Nadia Costa had lived on the Rio della Senza long enough to know the sound of Acqua Alta, before the sirens confirmed it, that low, patient gurgle of the lagoon, pushing back into the city through drains and door seams, the canals rising to reclaim the ground floor of every building foolish enough to have been built in the 16th century. She had already stacked her supplies on the second landing, already lifted the rugs, already set the rubber boots by the stairwell. She was 31 years old, and she had performed this ritual 100 times. She was not afraid of the water. She was afraid of the knock. It came at 11 at night, 3 slow strikes against the heavy street door, and it was wrong in a way she felt in her spine before she could name it. No one knocked in Venice after dark. Neighbors called out. Delivery men shouted from their boats. A knock, deliberate, unhurried, 3 times, belonged to someone who wanted to be let in, and had never in his life imagined the answer might be no. She went down the stone stairs with a flashlight, the flood already ankle-deep and freezing across the entrance hall. The surface of it black and mirror-smooth, throwing her own trembling light back up at the frescoed ceiling. Through the small grated window beside the door, she saw a boat she did not recognize, long, matte, expensive, no markings, and 2 men standing on the submerged threshold in water up to their shins, as though it were nothing, as though water would not dare climb higher than they permitted. And behind them a 3rd man, who did not stand in the water. He stood in the doorway of the boat's cabin, dry patient, watching her window, as if he had known exactly which pane of glass her face would appear behind. He was tall, in the way that changed the proportion of a room, dressed in black, that drank the flashlight beam. His face, when the light finally found it, was the kind of face painters had spent 5 centuries trying and failing to render honestly beautiful, and unsmiling, and closed like a door with something terrible behind it, or something wounded. She could not tell which. She would spend a long time not being able to tell which. "Signora Costa," he said, and his voice carried across the water without being raised. "I have brought you something to save." She should not have opened the door. She knew the name before she opened it, because in Venice, everyone knew the name Riva, the way they knew the name of the plague, spoken low, spoken quickly, spoken with the small, superstitious motion of the hand that Venetians used to push bad fortune back out to sea. The Riva family did not restore paintings. The Riva family owned the men who decided which bodies the lagoon kept and which it gave back. She opened the door anyway. She told herself later it was the painting, because he had in fact brought her something to save. His men carried it in on a rigid case the length of a coffin, held above the flood, and when they set it on her second-floor work table and opened the seals, the smell rose first. Old linseed, old dust, the particular sweet rot of a canvas that had spent decades somewhere damp and dark. Then the image, a 17th-century portrait, 3/4 length, a Venetian noblewoman in deep blue against a black ground, her face half-eaten by a bloom of gray-green varnish that had oxidized into an almost total blindness. Someone had also at some point driven something through the upper left corner, a puncture, an old violence, the canvas torn and clumsily backed. Nadia forgot the man in the room. That was the truth of her, the thing that had made her good and made her lonely. Put a wounded painting in front of her, and the world outside its frame simply stopped existing. She leaned in with her loupe, her breath held, and she felt the old familiar tenderness rise in her chest for a dead woman she would never meet, whose face had been waiting 400 years in the dark for someone to lift the veil. "It's badly oxidized," she murmured. "The varnish is gone. This tear will need lining. Whoever backed it did more damage than the blade." She straightened. "It's beautiful. Who is she?" "I don't know," Tommaso Riva said. He had not moved from the center of the room. He was watching her, not the painting. "That is one of the things I am paying you to tell me." He named a figure then for the restoration, and it was obscene 3 times what the finest studio in Milan would charge, 4 times what her drowning palazzo was worth. She heard herself start to refuse out of instinct, the way a decent person refuses money that is too clean to be clean. He raised one hand barely, and she stopped. "There are 2 conditions," he said. "You work alone, no students, no assistants, no colleagues, no photographs sent to any expert in any city. The painting does not leave this room, and neither does its image. This is not negotiable." He paused, and something moved behind his eyes, something she would only understand much later. "And the second condition, if you find anything beneath the surface, anything the artist did not intend to be seen, you tell no one, not the police, not your friends." A breath. Not even me. You finish the work and you wait. And you let me be the one to look. She should have thrown him out into the rising water. Instead, she looked back at the ruined face under the varnish, at the 400 years of patience in it, and she said, "Painters revise. It's called pentimento. You'll find a moved hand, a hidden collar, a dog painted out. It's very common. It means nothing." For the first time, Tommaso Riva almost smiled. It did not reach his eyes, and it did not warm the room. "You may be right," he said. "I hope for both of us that you're right." Then the flood took the lights. The palazzo dropped into darkness, and in the sudden black, she heard him move, soundless, certain a predator's economy, and felt, rather than saw him lift a candle from her work table, and strike a match so that when the light returned, it was small and gold, and it was his hand that held it, close enough that she could see the faint white line of an old scar across his knuckles, and smell rain and gun oil and something colder underneath. "Save her," he said quietly, and he was not looking at the painting. He left before dawn, when the tide turned and the water began its slow retreat back into the lagoon, leaving the ground floor slick and stinking, and the city scrubbed silver by the receding sea. He left two things behind. The first was the painting. The second was a man, one of the two who had stood in the flood, who took up a position in a moored boat at the mouth of the Rio, in full view of her windows, and did not leave, and did not pretend to be doing anything other than watching her door. Nadia told herself it was to guard the painting. She was a rational woman. She built her life on the principle that things were what they appeared to be, if you looked closely enough, that mystery was only insufficient magnification. She set up her lights, mixed her solvents, and began that first morning the slow, surgical work of taking 4 centuries off a dead woman's face. Restoration is not painting. It is closer to grief. You do not add, you remove. You dissolve the yellowed varnish a few square millimeters at a time, swab by swab, testing every solvent on every color, because pigments have their own chemistries and their own vulnerabilities, and a mistake is not a mistake. It is an amputation, permanent, a piece of a human being's vision gone forever because your hand was careless. She worked with a cotton swab rolled fine as a matchstick under raking light, her loupe pressed to her eye until the muscles of her face ached, and the noble woman's cheek came slowly up out of the gray, luminous, warm, a living flush of vermilion and lead white beneath the grime. The brushwork so confident and so tender that Nadia's throat tightened. Whoever had painted this had loved the woman in it. You could not fake that. Love left a signature no forger had ever cracked. It was on the 4th day, working across the shadowed side of the face, that she found the first wrong thing. Beneath the noble woman's jaw, where the shadow should have been simple and dark, her swab lifted the last of the varnish and revealed not shadow, a line. A fine, deliberate dark line that did not belong to the anatomy of the face, curving where no bone curved, and beside it another, and the ghost of a third, arranged with a geometry that was not accidental. She frowned. She adjusted the light. Under the raking beam, the surface threw tiny shadows, and in those shadows she saw that the paint here sat differently, that beneath the top layer of the portrait there was another layer, an older or a younger one, pressing up through the thin places like a body under a sheet. Pentimento, she thought. He revised. He painted her over something. She told herself this. She was very close to the painting. That was the thing about her loupe, about her whole life pressed that close. All she could ever see was the fragment, the single line, the single number. She could not see the shape they were part of. She had never once in 31 years been able to step back far enough to see the shape she was part of. She kept working, and the second face began 1 millimeter at a time to come up out of the dark to meet her. Tommaso Riva came back on the 7th night, and this time the water kept him. He arrived at dusk with the tide already climbing, meaning to look at her progress and leave. And by the time she had walked him through the clean quarter of the portrait, narrating the chemistry, the losses, the beautiful surviving passages, aware the entire time of how still he stood and how completely he watched her mouth when she spoke. The Acqua Alta had risen past the point of navigation. The Rio outside had become a black torrent. His man had already brought the boat under the loggia and lashed it. There was no leaving the palazzo until the small hours. So he stayed, and the palazzo for one night held the two of them in it like a closed hand. She should have been terrified, and part of her was, the animal part, The part that knew what he was, that had heard the stories about the man who was said to have walked into a rival's wedding and walked out the only one still breathing. But there is a specific intimacy the flood imposes on Venice, the way the whole city is forced up onto its second floors and higher ground, and made to wait out the sea together, candles in the windows, the streets erased. And in that forced closeness in the small gold room above the drowned city, she found herself doing the thing she never did. She talked. She told him about the palazzo which had belonged to her employer and mentor until he died, and left it to her, along with its debts, and its slow surrender to the lagoon. She told him she had no one, that her father had died when she was young, and her mother had gone before, that gone in a way no one would ever fully explain to her, gone when Nadia was 6 years old, and had never come back, and had never written, and had, as far as Nadia had been raised to believe, simply decided that a child was a thing you could set down and walk away from. She heard the old flatness in her own voice as she said it, the scar tissue over it, and she watched something happen in his face, a flinch quickly killed, that she was too far inside her own story to read. "You resent her," Tommaso said. It was not a question. "I stopped," Nadia said. "Resentment is exhausting. Now I just don't think about her." She looked at the candle. "People leave. You learn it or you don't survive it." He was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice had changed, gone lower and more careful, like a man setting something down that he did not want to break. "And if you learned she hadn't left you," he said, "if you learned she was taken." Nadia looked up sharply. "Why would you say that?" And there it was, the moment his eyes gave something away and then closed over it, the door swinging half open onto whatever wounded thing lived behind his face, and then shut. "I say a great deal I shouldn't," he said. "It's a flaw in a man in my position." He rose. He crossed to the painting and stood before it in the candlelight, and she watched him look at the half-cleaned face of the noblewoman with an expression she could not parse. Hunger and dread, and something that in any other man she would have called prayer. "How much longer?" he asked. "Until she's clean." The face. 2 weeks. The whole canvas a month more. She hesitated. Then, because the night had made her reckless, "There's something under it. You should know. A second image. I found it near the jaw and along the shoulder lines, and what might be figures. Numbers, maybe. It's very common. It's only a pentimento," he said. He did not turn around. "Yes, you told me." His shoulders had gone rigid. "Leave it, whatever it is. Clean the face, stabilize the tear, and leave the underlayer exactly as it is. Do you understand me? You do not chase what's underneath." "I'm a restorer," she said. "If there's a hidden composition beneath a genuine 17th century portrait, it's my job to at least document." He turned then, and the calm cracked just a hairline, just enough for her to see the thing under his surface, the way she had learned to see the thing under the paint. "There are men," he said quietly, "who would put this whole palazzo under the lagoon, with you inside it, to see what you're about to see. The less you know, the longer you live. That is not a threat, Signora Costa. It is the only kind thing I have said to anyone in 10 years. He picked up the candle again. "Now show me where I can wait for the tide." They came for the painting 3 nights later, and Nadia learned what he was. She was asleep on the 2nd floor when the sound woke her. Not a knock this time, but the low grind of a boat easing up under her loggia with its engine cut. Oars. Only the sound of people who did not want to be heard. She was at the window in her nightdress, with her heart in her mouth, when the first man came over the sill of the flooded ground floor, and she opened her lips to scream, and a hand closed over her mouth from behind, and an arm banded across her body, and pulled her down and back into the dark, and Tommaso's voice was against her ear, so low it was almost nothing. "Don't move, don't make a sound, stay behind me." He had come back that night too. The tide, the palazzo, some instinct she never learned which. He released her mouth. In the dimness she saw the shape of the gun in his hand, as naturally as another man might hold a pen. How many boats? 1. I think 1. He moved her with him along the wall, keeping his body between her and the stairwell, and she felt for the first time in her life what it was to be shielded, not held, not comforted, shielded. A wall of a man placing his own flesh between her and the thing coming up the stairs. 2 of them came up out of the flood, and what happened then happened in less time than it takes to describe it, and she carried the images the rest of her life. In fragments, the way she saw everything too close to see the whole. The muzzle flash, whiting out the frescoed ceiling. The noise like the palazzo splitting. Tommaso moving into the violence, instead of away from it. The impossible economy of him. And then, the black floodwater at the bottom of the stairs, going darker still, and a man face down in it, and the smell of copper and gunpowder rising through the wet stone, smell of the drowning house. And Tommaso, waist-deep in the black water at the foot of her stairs, blood soaking through his white shirt from a wound along his ribs that he did not appear to have noticed, turning back to look up at her, where she stood frozen and white on the landing, with her hand pressed to her mouth. Behind him the second man was gone, fled or dead, she never knew. And in the candlelight, the water around him was not black anymore. In one arm he held the gun, the other he had already lifted toward her palm. Open, the universal gesture that meant, stay, that meant, you're safe, that meant, I have you. They didn't come for you, he said, and his voice was perfectly, terribly calm. They came for what's under the paint. He climbed the stairs toward her dripping, bleeding, and she should have run from him. And instead, she found herself moving down toward him, reaching for the wound in his side, her restorer's hands that only ever knew how to save things, going to the ruin of him, on instinct. He caught her wrist before she could touch him, held it. For one long moment in the candlelight and the smell of blood, he simply held her wrist and looked at her, and she felt the whole weight of what he was not saying, and neither of them moved, and the water rose another inch around his knees. You need a doctor, she whispered. I need you to finish the painting, he said, and I need you to understand that from this moment you don't leave this house without me, and you don't answer the door, and you don't believe anyone who comes to you kindly. His grip on her wrist tightened just slightly, especially not if he comes kindly. The kind man came the next afternoon. He arrived by public traghetto like an ordinary citizen, an elegant old gentleman in a gray overcoat, with a silver-headed cane, and a face full of gentle, grandfatherly sorrow. And he stood on the fondamenta below her window, and called up to her with such warmth, such apparent grief, that she almost didn't obey Tommaso's rule. He introduced himself as Cosimo. He said he was Tommaso's uncle. He said, and here his old eyes filled convincingly, terribly, that he had come because he was frightened for her, that his nephew was not well, that his nephew had, God forgive the family, done things, and that the painting in her care was a sickness in the boy, an obsession that had already gotten men killed, and that if she cared at all for her own life, she would let Cosimo take the cursed thing off her hands and send her far from Venice, with enough money to begin again, somewhere the Rivas could not reach. He was very good. He was so good that Nadia, standing at her window with her arms wrapped around herself, felt the ground of her certainty tilt. Everything he said fit. Tommaso was a killer. She had watched him kill. The painting had brought armed men into her house, and here was a weeping old man offering her the one thing she had wanted her whole life, which was an exit, a clean escape, a door out of a story too big and too dark for her. Whatever is under that paint, Cosimo called up to her so softly, so kindly. Let it stay buried, my dear. Some grave should not be opened. I am only trying to keep you from falling into one. She said nothing. She stepped back from the window, and behind her, in the doorway of the workroom, Tommaso stood with the healing wound taped across his ribs, and a stillness in him like the moment before ice breaks, watching his uncle's gray overcoat through the glass. Everything he told you is true, Tommaso said quietly. That's what makes him the most dangerous man in this city. He never has to lie. He only has to choose which true things to say. That was the night she found the photographs, and the night the story stopped being about a painting. She had not been snooping. She had gone into the ground floor storeroom dry, now the tide low, to fetch a lining canvas from the cabinet where her late mentor had kept his supplies, and behind the rolls of linen, her hand found a flat case that did not belong to her, matte and black and expensive, the same black as everything Tommaso Riva touched. Left there, she did not know when. She should have left it. She opened it. Inside were photographs of herself, not one, not a dozen, hundreds. Nadia buying bread on the Strada Nuova. Nadia at her mentor's funeral veiled alone. Nadia at her workbench through the window, her face lit gold by the lamp taken from across the Rio. Nadia asleep. Nadia at 15, at 20, at 25. Photographs that predated by years the night he had first knocked on her door. There were documents too. Her birth certificate, a yellowed church record, and a single old photograph, cracked, of a woman Nadia had seen exactly twice in her life, in her own mirror, and rising slowly up out of the paint under a dead noblewoman's jaw. She was still kneeling on the stone floor, with the photograph spread around her like fallen leaves, when she heard him on the stairs, and she came up off the floor, with one of them fisted in her shaking hand, and her whole body vibrating with a fury that had 31 years of loneliness packed behind it. "How long?" she said. Her voice did not sound like her own. "How long have you been watching me?" He stopped in the doorway. He did not lie to her. She would remember that later, that even then, he did not insult her with a lie. 6 years, he said. 6, the word broke in her mouth. "You didn't find a painting and hire the nearest restorer. You came here for me. You chose me. This whole thing, the flood, the door, save her, all of it. I was a—" She could not finish. She threw the photograph at him, and it fell useless to the wet floor between them. "What am I? What am I to you? What is she?" She pointed with a trembling arm back up the stairs toward the workroom, toward the face coming up out of the dark. "That woman under the paint. I have her face. Who is she?" For a long moment, Tommaso Riva said nothing at all. And then the man, everyone in Venice feared, the man she had watched kill without changing his breathing, did something she had not thought him capable of. He lowered himself onto the flooded lowest stair and put his head in his hands. And when he spoke, his voice was rougher and younger than she had ever heard it. "Her name was Lucia," he said. "Lucia Costa. She was your mother, and she was the bravest person I have ever known, and she died because of it. And I was 11 years old, and I watched them do it, and I have spent every year since trying to find the thing she hid before they killed her." He lowered his hands and looked up at Nadia, and his eyes were wet, and he did not try to hide it. "You want to know what you are to me. You're the only reason any of it means anything, and I'm so sorry, because the truth is going to break you, and I brought it into your house." He told her the whole of it that night in the candlelit workroom, with the second face nearly free of the paint between them, and the city dark and drowned around the little island of their 2 chairs. 20 years ago there had been a massacre. The Rivas ran Venice then as now, but the old order was different. There was a council and a set of books, the true books, the record of every debt and every murder and every payment that bound the families together, kept by a single archivist whose neutrality was sacred, whose person no one dared touch. That archivist had been a woman, a painter, gifted, married into the outer edge of the family, trusted precisely because she loved none of them, and owed none of them, and could not be bought. Her name was Lucia Costa, and she kept the ledger not on paper, but in her head. And when she needed to preserve it, in the one language she trusted no one else could read, she painted it, encoded, disguised as revision, hidden in the underlayers of old canvases that passed through her hands for cleaning. A record no fire could burn without burning the art it hid inside, which even these men would not do. And then Cosimo Riva, the family's notary, the keeper of the money, had decided the old order was a cage. He arranged a night of family gathering at a villa on the lagoon, and he had it burned, and everyone in it killed, Tommaso's father among them, and blamed it on a rival house, and used the war that followed to seize everything. It was flawless, except for one thing. Lucia Costa had seen it coming. In the weeks before, she had painted the truth of it, Cosimo's name, the account numbers that moved the blood money, the date, all of it, into the underlayer of a damaged 17th century portrait, passing through her studio, and she had painted her own face into it, too small, and hidden beside the numbers, a signature, a message across time. "This is real, and I made it, and someone I love will find it." Then she had sent her 6-year-old daughter away in the night to a great aunt in Padua with a false name, told the child nothing to keep the child alive, and stayed to finish her work. They killed her before she could get the painting out. In the chaos and the fire it vanished, sold, looted, lost, into the vast anonymous river of Venetian art, one damaged portrait among thousands. Cosimo spent 20 years and a fortune hunting it, because as long as it existed, his throne was built over a trap door. And a boy of 11 named Tommaso, who had watched his father die and been raised afterward by the very uncle who had ordered it, spent 20 years hunting it too, for the opposite reason. To open the trap door, to make his uncle fall through it. "I found the painting 8 months ago," Tommaso said, "in a dead collector's estate in Trieste, and I found you 6 years ago when I finally traced the archivist's child. And then I had the painting, and I had the only restorer in the world I could trust to surface it without destroying it, and she was the daughter of the woman who painted it, Lucia's daughter with Lucia's hands and Lucia's face. His voice failed. I told myself I was using you. It was easier than the truth. Nadia was crying without sound, the way she did everything, contained alone, even in her grief. She looked at the face in the painting, her mother's face, 20 years and 400 years, and a lifetime of resentment surfacing at once out of the dark. She didn't leave me, she said. She saved you, Tommaso said. It was the only thing she did that Cosimo couldn't undo. She hid you, the way she hid the truth. And you've been sitting 3 feet from both your whole life, without knowing. Nadia reached out and very gently, with the tenderness she had only ever spent on the dead, laid 2 fingers against the painted cheek of her mother. Then I'm going to finish her, she said. All of it. The face and the numbers and the name. I don't care who dies to keep it buried. She turned and looked at Tommaso, and something had changed in her, the vulnerable thing gone hard and bright. You've been alone with this for 20 years. You're not alone anymore. Neither am I. He crossed the room and stopped in front of her, closer than he had ever let himself be, and lifted one hand, as if to touch her face, and stopped the hand hovering. The old discipline, the fear of ruining the one thing he had ever wanted to keep. And Nadia, who had spent her whole life removing what shouldn't be there to reveal what was underneath, reached up and closed the last inch herself, and pressed his palm to her cheek. Neither of them spoke. The candle burned. The face of her mother watched them both from 4 centuries away, and under the mother's face still hidden, the numbers waited. Cosimo did not come kindly the 3rd time. He must have known Nadia never learned how a paid boatman, a long lens, the same all-seeing patience that had let him rule a city from behind a grandfather's smile. That the painting was nearly finished, that the numbers were nearly free, that the trapdoor beneath his 20-year reign was about to swing open. And so, on the last night, the night of the highest tide of the season, when the sirens wailed and the whole city climbed to its upper floors, and the lagoon poured back into Venice to reclaim it, Cosimo Riva sent everything he had to put the palazzo and everyone in it under the water for good. They came in 3 boats. Tommaso had 4 men and himself. The math was not survivable, and every person in the drowning house knew it. Finish it, Tommaso told her, already moving, already loading the calm back over him like armor. Whatever happens down there, you get the numbers up, out of the paint, and you photograph them, and you send them to the address I'm going to give you. And then it doesn't matter what they do to us, because by morning, every family in Italy, and half the magistrates in Rome, will have the true books, and Cosimo Riva will be a dead man walking, whether he takes this house or not. He pressed a slip of paper into her hand, folded her fingers over it, held them. For 1 second the killer disappeared, and there was only a man looking at a woman he had waited his whole life to find, and expected to lose within the hour. Nadia, whatever you hear, don't come down those stairs. Then the water and the men came into the house together, and the palazzo turned into gunfire and flood. She did as he asked, and it was the hardest thing she had ever done, to kneel over her mother's painting in the candlelight, with the whole world tearing itself apart below her, and steady her shaking hands and work, swab by swab, millimeter by millimeter. She took the last of the top layer off the hidden panel, while men died on her stairs, and the numbers came up out of the dark at last, black and deliberate and absolute. A name, a date, a string of account codes in a dead woman's hand. The confession of Cosimo Riva, painted 20 years before he thought himself untouchable. Nadia photographed it with hands that would not stop trembling. She typed the address on the paper. She pressed send, and somewhere in the drowned city, a decade of secrets began to move faster than any boat, out through the dark, to 100 inboxes at once, unkillable now, unburyable, free. Then the gunfire stopped, and in the ringing silence she heard against every instruction the sound of a single man dragging himself up her flooded stairs, and she could not obey. She went to the top of the landing. Tommaso Riva stood waist-deep in the black floodwater at the foot of the stairs, and he was the thumbnail image she would carry to her grave. The white shirt gone red across the whole left side, one arm curled around the ruined portrait to keep it out of the water, the gun hanging spent from his other hand, 4 men down in the black flood behind him, and the boats of the 5th already turning to run. He looked up at her, and his face was gray, and his knees were going, and behind him, framed in the drowned doorway, with a silver-headed cane and no more grandfather in his eyes, stood Cosimo, raising a pistol at the back of his nephew's skull. Nadia did not think. There was a solvent bottle in her hand, glass and heavy, and she threw it down the stairs with everything in her, and it took the old man across the face, and Tommaso, half dead on instinct, 20 years of waiting, compressed into one motion, turned and fired. And Cosimo Riva went backward into the black water of the house he had tried to make her grave, and the lagoon that had kept the family's secrets for 20 years closed over the man who had made them and did not give him back. He almost died on her workbench, laid out beside the painting he had bled to protect, while she pressed her restorer's hands to the ruin of his side, and for once was not too late to save the thing in front of her. A doctor came in the small hours, one of his silent and quick. The tide turned before dawn the way it always did, and the water drained back out of the palazzo and out of the city, and left everything raw and silver and washed clean. And Tommaso Riva lived. By the time the sun came up, it was over in the wider world too. Though Nadia only understood the scale of it later, the true books, her mother's books painted into the dark and freed 4 centuries and 20 years late by her daughter's hands, landed everywhere at once. There was no burying them. Cosimo's whole architecture of lies came down in a week, and the empire he had murdered a family to steal came apart in the hands of magistrates who had waited a generation for exactly this. And the name Riva began slowly to mean something other than plague. And Nadia finished the painting. She spent the rest of that spring on it long after there was any reason but love. She lined the tear the blade had made 20 years before. She cleaned the last of the 4 centuries off the noblewoman's face. And when the top image was whole and radiant again, she made a decision no restorer in her right mind would make. She did not paint back over the underlayer. She left a window in it, a small, cleared panel, low in the shadow of the noblewoman's shoulder, through which, forever now, you could see the second face. Lucia Costa's face, the archivist, the painter, the mother, small and clear, and looking out at whoever came close enough to find her. A signature across time that had finally reached its reader. They hung it in the workroom on the 2nd floor above the waterline, where the light off the canal moved across it all day. And in the evenings, Tommaso Riva, who no longer flinched from touch, who had learned late and completely how to want one single thing openly, would stand behind Nadia with his arms around her and his chin against her hair, the two of them looking at the 2 faces in the painting, the beautiful stranger on the surface and the brave dead woman underneath. And neither of them would say anything, because there was nothing that needed saying anymore. "You said people leave," he said to her once on such an evening, his voice low against her temple. "That you learned it, or you didn't survive it." "I was wrong," Nadia said. She laid her hand over his where it rested on her heart. "Some people spend 20 years coming back." Below them, the tide was rising again, the patient lagoon returning to reclaim the ground floor of the sinking palazzo, the way it had 1,000 times before, and would 1,000 times again. But they were above it now, the 2 of them in the small gold room, with the light on the water and the 2 faces watching over them. And for the first time in either of their lives, neither one of them was waiting to be left. The water could have the rest of the house. It could have the whole drowning city. It would never again take anything from her that she couldn't get back.